Imagine for a moment you're walking into a vast cinema complex. But instead of just one main feature, there are multiple captivating films playing on different screens simultaneously.
Right.
Each one is drawing you in, telling a powerful story, and they're all unfolding at once. That's kind of one way to picture the world we're diving into today.
It's a good image, yeah. Because the core question we're exploring is, well, it's fundamental. Is the era of American global dominance truly over?
Exactly. For decades, really. After the Cold War ended, many observers, people like Charles Krauthammer talked about a unipolar moment. The U.S., they argued, stood alone, unmatched global power. But now, well, now you've got giants like China surging, India rising really fast, and even Russia and the European Union flexing their muscles. So the debate is really heating up. Are we actually shifting into a world with several great powers, or is it maybe more complex?
That's precisely what we're here to unpack for you. We'll start by, clarifying what these terms unipolarity, bipolarity, multipolarity actually mean. Then we'll weigh the different kinds of power a nation can wield, the hard military stuff versus the more subtle influence of soft power.
And crucially, we'll zero in on some of the key geopolitical flashpoints, the things that are not just shaping but maybe accelerating this massive global shift. So yeah, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
So when we talk about global polarity, what are we really discussing? How do we, define these different eras?
Okay, at its simplest, global polarity just describes how many major centers of power exist in the world at any given time. So unipolarity, as you mentioned, means a world where one country basically rules the roost.
Right.
After the Soviet Union collapsed, early 90s, the U.S. effectively stood alone, overwhelmingly dominant economically, militarily, politically. Krauthammer's phrase, the unipolar moment, it really captured that specific post-Cold War feeling.
And you could really feel it back then, couldn't you? Hollywood movies, Silicon Valley tech, they weren't just products. They were setting global trends, showing off this huge cultural and economic influence.
Well, almost like that single-screen cinema, yeah. Showing one American blockbuster everywhere.
That's a perfect way to put it. Then, okay, we move to bipolarity, an era where two superpowers kind of divide up global influence. The clearest historical example, the Cold War. Roughly 1947 to 1991. United States on one side, Soviet Union on the other. Two poles.
And that era was defined by intense rivalry, right? Just thinking about the rival alliances, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, both sides building up huge nuclear arsenals and this constant competition playing out in proxy wars all over the world.
Exactly. Each power had its own sphere of influence, mostly not overlapping.
Yeah.
What's fascinating about these definitions is just how dramatically the whole global landscape can shift.
Yeah.
And that brings us to multipolarity.
This means a world with many centers of power. No single state dominates. Instead, you have several countries, or maybe blocks of countries, sharing influence. And historically, this was actually pretty common. Think about 19th century Europe, for instance. Lots of great powers shifting alliances.
So the argument today is that we might be heading back to that kind of world, a more complex, multifaceted global stage. Beyond the U.S., we're talking about major players like China, India, Russia, maybe the European Union as a whole, and other rising regional powers too.
That's the idea. If we connect this to the bigger picture, multipolarity suggests a future with, well, maybe more shifting alliances, more issue-based coalitions. A world where no single nation just calls all the shots. It's less about one or two big powers and more about a dynamic interplay, like those multiple movies playing at once in that cinema you mentioned, each with its own stars.
That sets the stage really well. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Who's actually got the power in this evolving global landscape? We should try and size up the main contenders across different types of power, economic, military, tech, culture, using some real data points.
Okay, let's start with the economy. Using GDP as a basic measure, the United States still leads. We're talking roughly $27.7 trillion. That's about a quarter of the whole world's output.
Wow.
Canada is clearly second at around $17.8 trillion.
And then you've got the European Union. Collectively, they're an absolute giant. Projected around $20 trillion nominal GDP in 2025, so about 1/6 of the world total.
Right. Then there's India, growing incredibly fast, around $3.6 trillion now, nearly as big as Japan's economy. And Russia's economy is considerably smaller, maybe around $2 billion.
But there's a nuance there, isn't there? It's not just the total size.
Exactly. What's crucial here, maybe the real insight, isn't just the raw GDP, it's the difference in individual wealth. Per person, per capita, the U.S. and the EU are very wealthy. High individual income, high consumption. China and India, though, they have these vast overall markets, huge populations, but still much lower per person incomes. So their massive economic power rests on a very different foundation, and that affects their global leverage in, well, subtle ways.
That's a key distinction. Okay, next up, military power, or, hard power. This seems to be where the U.S. is still, well, glaringly in the lead.
Oh, absolutely. In 2024, the U.S. spent about $997 billion on defense. That figure is staggering. It's roughly 37% of all global military spending.
37%? Wow.
Yeah, it's about 3.2 times more than China, which is the next biggest spender.
Okay, in China's budget.
China's is substantial, around $314 billion, and it's growing fast. Russia comes in at about $149 billion, and India is spending around $80 to $100 billion. They're in the top five, but still, you see the scale difference compared to the U.S.
And it's not just the spending, is it? It's the ability to project that power globally. Force projection.
Precisely. The U.S. has dozens of overseas bases, 11 aircraft carriers, incredibly advanced tech. But others are catching up, or at least trying to build their own capabilities. China's building up rapidly more carriers, advanced missiles, a big space program. India's expanding its navy and space abilities, too. And Russia, well, it still has the world's largest nuclear arsenal.
And we're seeing changes triggered by events, too, right? Like Ukraine.
Definitely. The war in Ukraine has pushed European countries, especially Germany and Poland, to sharply increase their defense spending. They're investing more in their own defense now, not just relying on the U.S. shield quite as much. It reflects this shifting security picture.
Okay, what about technology and innovation? That's another key area.
Yeah, absolutely crucial. The U.S. still tends to dominate in the really cutting-edge stuff. Think AI, biotech, aerospace, semiconductors, American universities, Silicon Valley. They're powerhouses. The Global Innovation Index for 2024 puts the U.S. around third globally. Still very high.
But China's innovating incredibly fast, too, aren't they?
Oh, yes. They rank around 11th on that same index. They excel in areas like 5G, think Huawei solar panels, electric vehicles, and they've filed a massive number of AI patents. It shows huge investment and progress, really focusing on scaling innovation for their enormous market.
And India.
India's tech sector is booming. World-class IT industry, a fast-growing space program. They're definitely a player. And let's not forget the EU. Countries like Germany and France invest heavily in R&D, leading in things like automotive tech and green energy. So innovation. It's truly a global race now, not just a U.S. show.
Right. Okay, finally, let's touch on culture and society.
Yeah.
What people call soft power.
Yes, Joseph Nye's concept. It's about a nation's culture, its values, its policies, things that attract others through persuasion, not force, winning hearts and minds, essentially.
And the U.S. still seems pretty dominant here, right? Hollywood, global music, English being this sort of lingua franca, those world-famous universities, aid programs.
Absolutely. All of that makes the U.S. incredibly familiar and, well, influential around the world. Brand Finance's latest soft power ranking for 2025 put the U.S. at number 1, score of around 79.5, especially strong in education, science, media influence. It's a global brand, and no question.
But things are shifting here, too.
Definitely. What's really fascinating is China's rapid climb. They just overtook the UK to hit number 2. Their score is around 72.8. That's driven by huge projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, those Confucius Institutes promoting language and culture, massive spending on diplomacy, a global media push.
But there's a catch.
There is. Their image still struggles on perceived friendliness. It's a good reminder that hard power doesn't automatically translate into soft appeal. It's different.
What about India?
India has strong soft power, too. Think Bollywood's global reach, yoga, cuisine, that huge and often well-respected diaspora. They were ranked 8th by Brand Finance in 2023. Russia's soft power is generally weaker globally, though it uses media like RT and maintains ties with certain countries. And the EU has significant soft power through its diplomacy, development aid, cultural exports often built around shared values.
So if we try to tie all this together, hard power, military economic, and soft power, culture influence.
Yeah.
They don't always line up perfectly, do they?
Not at all. The U.S. is a powerhouse in both. China's hard power is immense. Its soft power is rising fast, but still faces challenges. The EU has huge economic weight and influence based on its norms and values. India's economic and soft power seem to be rising together. Russia, strong militarily, but more isolated diplomatically, which hurts its soft power.
Can you give us a concrete example of that difference?
Sure. Think about international students. In 2023, the U.S. hosted around 900,000 foreign students. China hosted about 320,000. That's a huge gap.
Yeah.
That shows the pull, the attraction of U.S. education and society. Or look at global media. Hollywood films are everywhere. China is spending billions trying to promote its own content globally, but it's still playing catch-up in terms of broad appeal.
That difference in appeal really matters, doesn't it? Hard power can compel, but soft power, that's about persuasion, about shaping long-term influence and alliances. It's a different kind of magnetism.
Exactly.
Okay, so with all these different power dynamics swirling around, let's pivot to the key geopolitical flashpoints, the big events that are actively reshaping this new world order. These are like the major plot twists in our global cinema analogy.
Absolutely. And the Ukraine war, starting in 2022, is just massive. Russia's invasion, it's profoundly reshuffled alliances, sped up existing trends. Europe, with war right on its doorstep, has dramatically increased defense spending.
And NATO. People were questioning its relevance.
Right. And now it's seen as reinvigorated. New members like Sweden joining, higher budgets pretty much across the board.
It feels like the conflict has also made the global divisions clearer, maybe. Like blocs forming.
It has solidified a picture, though it's complex. Some talk about a three-block world. You've got the Western democracies, US, EU, cooperating strongly, sending huge amounts of aid to Ukraine. Then you have an autocratic bloc, maybe? Russia, now very closely tied to Iran, North Korea, others, partly because they're all under Western sanctions.
And a fair bloc.
And then, crucially, you have many emerging powers. India is a prime example, but much of the global south, too. They're actively trying not to pick sides. They see downsides to aligning too closely with either the West or the Russia-China axis. This conflict has really accelerated the end of that post-Cold War order, pushing us faster towards multipolarity. It's a huge driver of change.
Another really big one is China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. That's been going since 2013. This isn't just about trade routes, is it? It's about influence.
Oh, fundamentally, China has pumped hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions by some estimates, into ports, railways, roads across Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America.
And the effect?
It effectively ties dozens of countries into China's economic orbit. Beijing gains significant leverage through these huge infrastructure loans and construction contracts. Think high-speed rail in Indonesia, strategic ports in Pakistan or East Africa. Now, critics raise serious concerns about debt traps and sustainability.
Right. The debt trap diplomacy argument.
Exactly. But regardless of the criticism, there's no denying the BRI has massively expanded China's economic reach and political clout.
And the U.S. and allies are trying to counter this.
They are. Initiatives like the Build Back Better World were announced, aiming to offer alternatives. But for our discussion today, the BRI is a prime example of China using economic and, to some extent, soft power to build a network of partners. It boosts China's voice, shapes norms, and directly challenges that old unipolar model where Washington set most of the rules.
Speaking of alternative groupings, what about the BRICS expansion? That seemed like a big deal.
It was significant, yeah. In 2023, the original BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, invited 6 new members: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, Argentina, and the UAE. They were set to join in 2024. That nearly doubles the group size and definitely its geopolitical weight and reach.
So what's the goal there? Is it explicitly anti-Western?
It certainly signals an attempt by these nations, many from the global south, to build a kind of counterweight to Western-dominated institutions like the G7 or the World Bank. Some definitely see it as a coalition challenging the old order, demanding a more multipolar world where their voices are heard more clearly.
But is it a unified bloc? They seem to have very different interests sometimes.
That's the key question. Cohesion is a real issue. China wants more global influence. Saudi Arabia wants investment diversification. India wants strategic autonomy. Their interests don't always align perfectly, but still, the expansion itself is a major sign of multipolarity in action. New groups forming, alternative leadership emerging.
Let's talk about India specifically. Its role seems increasingly critical in this shifting landscape.
Absolutely. World's largest democracy, 1.4 billion people, economy growing fast, around 6–7% a year, modernizing military. India is undeniably on the rise.
And it occupies this really unique position, doesn't it? Sort of between the major blocs.
It really does. It has deep growing ties with the West. The U.S.-India strategic partnership is crucial for both. India's in the Quad with the U.S., Japan, Australia, aimed partly at balancing China. But at the same time, India fiercely guards its strategic autonomy. It prioritizes its own national interests above all else.
That balancing act is fascinating, like how India hasn't joined Western sanctions on Russia. Still buying lots of Russian oil, which must cause some friction with Washington.
It does create diplomatic complexities, for sure. But then India also buys advanced U.S. military hardware, like jets and drones. It shows they're determined to maintain relationships across the board and make decisions based on their own calculations. India is becoming a truly independent global player, adding another major pole to this multipolar picture.
Okay, one more flashpoint. The U.S. pivot to Asia, or the focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Right. As China has risen, successive U.S. administrations have tried to rebalance strategic focus towards Asia. It's not just rhetoric.
What does that look like in practice?
It includes new security pacts like AUKUS, the deal for the U.S. and U.K. to help Australia get nuclear-powered submarines, strengthening the existing Quad, bolstering alliances with traditional partners like Japan and South Korea, but also newer or revived partnerships like with the Philippines.
And the underlying reason?
It reflects Washington's deep concern that if Asia, the world's economic engine room and manufacturing hub, falls too heavily under Chinese influence, then global power really will shift decisively eastward. So the pivot is an attempt by the U.S. to adapt to multipolarity by shoring up its own regional bloc, trying to maintain influence in that critical region.
So we've looked at the concepts, the players, the flashpoints. It's incredibly complex. What about the future? Where might all this be heading? I know nobody has a crystal ball.
Exactly, no crystal ball. But analysts do describe several possible scenarios, different potential futures for this multipolar world, like different movies that might play out.
Okay, what's one possibility?
Well, one is strategic competition, basically a new Cold War. This is the more pessimistic view, right? We drift into rigid blocks, constant confrontation, the US-EU versus China-Russia and their respective allies competing fiercely in every domain, trade wars, tech standards like 5G, military bases, maybe even space and cyber conflict.
Sounds familiar, unfortunately.
It does. Like the first Cold War, you'd see clear spheres of influence, proxy conflicts popping up, maybe an escalating arms race in new technologies like AI or hypersonic missiles. An EY report we looked at suggested this is quite likely enduring blocks. A Western one, a Russia-led autocratic one, and then many unaligned countries trying to navigate carefully between them. A world of clear sides.
Okay, what's a more optimistic scenario?
That would be multipolar cooperation. The idea here is that global cooperation could actually emerge, maybe through new institutions or by reforming old ones like the UN. Countries might form shifting coalitions based on specific issues.
And climate change?
Exactly. Imagine China, the EU, and the US actually finding common ground and leading on climate action or on future pandemic responses, even while they compete fiercely elsewhere. We could see new economic forums emerge beyond the G20 or maybe regional blocs like ASEAN in Asia or the African Union gaining more clout and negotiating power. The BRICS expansion hints at this possibility, developing nations trying to unite on common challenges.
Then there's a middle ground, maybe.
Yeah, some analysts talk about a hybrid or perhaps a G0 world. The idea is there's no single overarching order, just overlapping rules and interests. Countries pursue their goals pragmatically. Many emerging states, as that EY piece noted, would likely aim for neutral or transactional stances, dealing with whoever offers the best deal on a given issue.
So less about fixed alliances, more about flexible partnerships.
Pretty much. In this scenario, the U.S. might leverage its tech-led and military reach. China pushes its economic ties through things like BRI, and India continues its balancing act.
Yeah.
Global governance becomes more fragmented. Maybe issue-specific leadership emerges, like that climate triumvirate idea, U.S., China, EU, or a space coalition involving all the major players. It's a less predictable, more fluid, maybe messier world.
And one more possibility you mentioned, regional blocs.
Right. Power might cluster mainly along geographic lines. You could picture distinct spheres, maybe an Atlantic Pact, US plus EU plus UK, a Eurasian bloc, Russia plus China plus Central Asia, an Indo-Pacific coalition, US plus India plus Japan plus Australia, and perhaps an emerging global South alliance built around BRICS, Africa, Latin America.
And how would that work?
Each bloc would likely have its own internal trade rules, security arrangements, maybe even tech standards. Competition would then play out primarily between these large regional groupings. It'd feel like a very segmented world, like different theaters in our cinema, each showing its own distinct genre.
Okay, so after diving deep into all these shifts, the definitions, the power dynamics, the flashpoints, the possible futures, let's circle back to that big question we started with. Are we truly witnessing the end of American global dominance?
Well, based on everything we've looked at from the sources, the simplest answer seems to be probably yes. That unchallenged unipolar moment where one country was so clearly dominant across the board, That seems unlikely to come back.
Mm.
Instead, we appear to be sliding, maybe stumbling, into a world with multiple powerful states and blocks, a multipolar world. But, and this is the crucial part, how that world functions, whether it's conflictual, cooperative, or just messy, that's still very much up in the air. The script is still being written.
Which really brings it back to you listening right now. We want you to think about some of these really big questions. For instance, do you believe these major powers, the U.S., China, Russia, India, can actually cooperate effectively on huge global challenges, things like climate change or pandemics? Or is competition just too strong, destined to keep them at odds?
Is something like a new Cold War basically inevitable now, with rigid blocks and constant rivalry? Or could we see a more fluid, multi-aligned world emerge, where countries shift partnerships depending on the issue at hand?
What about the emerging powers? Could countries like India, Brazil, maybe others really change the game by forging new kinds of partnerships, maybe challenging both the U.S. and China? And what role do you think soft power, culture, ideas, basic attraction will play in shaping whatever future emerges? Can the U.S. still effectively win hearts and minds? Or will other cultures and narratives rise to greater prominence on the world stage?
We'd genuinely love to know what you think. Which of those scenarios we discussed sounds most plausible to you? And maybe more importantly, which kind of world do you think would actually be best for everyone?
It's clear the world is changing incredibly fast. Staying curious, asking these kinds of questions, feels more important than ever. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and we'll keep exploring these complex issues together.